Let's get more analysis on this from Omar Baddar. He's a Middle East political analyst based here in Washington, D.C. Omar, good to have you with us. Both President Trump and Israel's Netanyahu say this deal is a step toward peace in the Middle East. Is it?
It really is not. This is primarily a cheap political stunt by the Trump administration to try to achieve some kind of success, because the Trump administration has been a miserable failure on many fronts. With the pandemic, as your report was just talking about, how the U.S. is the epicenter of the pandemic at this point, and as well as foreign policy, where there were a lot of promises about what the Trump administration was going to be able to achieve, and it did not. So in this case, there's nothing particularly really groundbreaking or historic about this deal, because the UAE and Israel already had a long existing partnership under the table, and all this deal is bringing that basically out of the closet, in a sense. It's just bringing something into the surface that has already been in the works. And the Trump administration talks about it as if it's a historic deal, as if he brought two historic enemies together or something. And that's just really an attempt at political posturing that I think is driven by the fact that both Trump and Netanyahu have elections coming up, and they're trying to shore up some sense of success in the region.
But then why would the UAE agree to it after decades? What would be motivating their decision to take part in this?
Look, it's a gamble on their part. There are so many Arab countries where the governments, of course, these are not governments that are representative of their people. They're authoritarian governments and not democratically elected. And many of them, because of public opinion in the region, felt the need to keep Israel at arm's length, because given Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories and its oppression and human rights violations against Palestinians, which are incredibly unpopular in the region, there was a sense that you don't want to seem as if you're embracing of that or disregarding of that. And in this case, it is a bit of a gamble. I think the leadership at the UAE is invested in a Trump presidency. Trump has been really with both Netanyahu and the UAE, sort of the kind of leader who gives them a blank check to behave however they wanted, whether it's regards to Yemen, in the case of the UAE, or regards to the Palestinians when it comes to Israel. And I think they're taking a chance and coming out in public. They've been flirting with this for a while. When Trump announced the so-called deal of the century, which is really just an annexation plan for Israel to take over all of the Palestinian territories, the UAE's response was a bit mixed. They were hinting at the fact that they were not entirely against it. Their official position was that they were against it, but you had the foreign minister tweeting in support of it. So I think that the timing is a bit odd, and I think it's a bit of a gamble.
I want to pick up on that point, if I can, really quick, Omar. The UAE's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs went so far as to say that this deal that they've made is a death blow to the annexation of Palestinian lands. I mean, what's your reaction to that statement?
Look, I think that's a gross exaggeration of the role of the UAE in halting official annexation declaration. We should be clear about the fact that annexation is already a de facto reality on the ground. Israel has already taken over the Palestinian territories, expanded settlements endlessly, and is the country that is in control of Palestinian lives entirely. What Israel is putting off is merely declaring it. And the reason why Israel had already put off that declaration of annexation is because they already noticed that there was significant international opposition to it, including unprecedentedly in the U.S., where Democratic politicians were talking about conditioning U.S. aid to Israel if Israel proceeds with announcing annexation. And that's the real reason they backed away from it. And now I think this pretense that they did it only because of this deal with the UAE is just an attempt by everyone to save face. Netanyahu wanted to save face with his right-wing audience that was demanding the settler movement, that was demanding this annexation to proceed. And I think in the case of the UAE, it's just a fig leaf to try to cover the reason why they're proceeding with developing relationships with Israel at the expense of Palestinian human rights, breaking with the understanding that Arab countries were not going to proceed with normalization until Israel afforded freedom and human rights to Palestinians.
All right, Omar Baddar, appreciate you coming on to share your perspective with us. Thanks for that.